If you're looking to get into DAW-less and or portable music production, chances are you're looking for a Groovebox. But at this point, there are a ton out there with a ton of different price points and features, and it can feel a little paralyzing to try to choose one. So today I want to try to help you develop some criteria and some understanding for how to choose the right Groovebox for you specifically. This is going to be a long video, most likely, so feel free to skip around using the chapters below. And without any further ado, let's get into it. First, let's talk about the criteria I'm going to be using, and there are 4 of them. There's price, user experience, purpose, and sound. And I'm going to play some audio examples at the very end, so stay tuned for that. This one's fairly obvious, but it is an important consideration. If you're a bit younger or a bit newer to music production or to Grooveboxes, you're probably going to want something under $500. And there is a bit of a price threshold, probably past $300, where you go from fairly limited devices that are fun, but the novelty wears off quickly, to a fully featured, powerful station. So the Novation circuit easily comes to mind because that is within that price range, and it is a great introductory Groovebox with plenty of room for experienced producers to experiment and grow. And at this point, a secondhand Roland MC101 gives you some pretty insane value for your money as well. And as you go up in price, you typically go up in size and complexity, number of tracks, and power. Typically. A few notable exceptions to more price equals bigger Groovebox are the OPZ, the OP1, the Black Box, and the Deluge. Different manufacturers build different gear with different expectations for how the user is supposed to interact with them. And that means a bunch of different devices will have very different workflows and different approaches to making electronic music. And knowing a bit about this stuff going in can be super helpful. Different producers from different generations, both age-wise and generations of electronic music, will have differing tolerances for things like menu diving and other bits of workflow that could be considered a little more archaic. And different people will want their device to be really hands-on or will be willing to sacrifice that for more power. And this can be really important. One of the main reasons I got into Grooveboxes is to get away from the computer, because in my job of civil engineering, I look at a computer pretty much all day, and so I want my hobby to be a break from that. Having a bigger screen that you rely on more definitely makes a device more powerful, but it can also kill some workflow momentum and maybe make working on that device less hands-on and therefore less satisfying. It definitely depends on the person and how they like to work. In terms of modern intuitive workflow, the Novation circuit is pretty much king. This thing is made by the same people who made the Launchpad. To give you an idea of how it's laid out, the pads are the screen, but once you remember where the buttons and the pads and the knobs are, you could do it with your eyes closed. And I am super friggin' fast and efficient on this thing, and the device just kind of disappears and all that's left is making beats, which is lovely. The Roland MC101 is not far behind, actually. There's definitely a bit more menu diving and a bit more memorizing, hitting shift and hitting a bunch of different buttons, but overall, I've gotten used to it, and its vast feature set makes that worth it. So if you are newer to electronic music production, those are the 2 devices that I think would serve you quite well. Next would be the Korg Electribe 2s. Those start to feel a little bit antiquated in their workflow, but are still mostly hands-on, very tactile, very based on the pads. And while the learning curve is a little steeper, it's not too bad. I mentioned the Roland MC101's menu diving. Another device that has that, but probably a little worse, is the Model Cycles, and some Electron stuff definitely is a very different flavor of workflow and will take some getting used to, so just bear that in mind. A lot of people really adore it, and I've come to like it. But still, the one that I have used, the Model Cycles, is incredibly hands-on and has a lot of buttons. It's very tactile, which I do really like. And then you start getting into stuff like the Black Box, which is mostly touchscreen, or some of the machine type stuff that does rely a bit more on a screen, and I do find that kind of irritating. And yes, I am slowly working on learning the Machine Plus. For the OPZ, your mileage will probably vary because you can use it just self-contained with all the buttons and remember how that works, but a lot of people like to connect it to an iOS device and use it with the screen, so that really depends on the person. Obviously, there are a ton of others out there, but these are just a few. Once again, the main takeaway is how tactile do you want it to be and how easy and intuitive do you want it to be. And there is absolutely no shame in preferring an easy and intuitive workflow, because a janky, counterintuitive workflow absolutely can kill a creative session. This category is probably the most important, and it's the most all-encompassing one, because what you intend to do with your Groovebox will really dictate which one you get. For instance, personally, I really like a device that's an entirely self-contained, all-in-one music production station that can also do live jamming, meaning stuff like the Novation Circuit, the Roland MC101, and the Korg Electribe are perfect for me. Some people will care less about the jamming aspect, in which case you're just going to use it to lay down a bunch of tracks and then export those individually and refine them in your DAW. Others like to just use these devices as sketch pads, ways to tinker, dream up ideas, and then eventually bring those ideas somewhere else and complete them more properly. And absolutely nothing wrong with that. That's a totally valid way of using these devices. It's just a different approach. And there are the people who like to use a Groovebox as the central hub, the central brain of a hardware setup. Personally, I have very little interest in that. I like stuff being self-contained, but that is 100% personal preference and the way I like to work. And beyond that, you might have a very specific way you like to deal with sounds or make music, and so certain features of a Groovebox might either be selling points or the lack of them might make a Groovebox a no-go. So I'm gonna run through a few of these really quickly. One key item is working with samples. Different people rely more on synth stuff, making sounds and manipulating them. Other people will rely more on flipping samples, maybe chopping them up, maybe pitching them around, and different devices deal with this stuff quite differently. The Circuit does an okay job. You can't flip samples chromatically, but you can fit a lot of them onto the sample tracks, and it's much more powerful than you'd initially think. The Roland MC101 is probably the smallest, cheapest way to flip samples, both pitching them around to a keyboard, loading a bunch into a drum track, or even chopping up samples and flipping them for hip-hop or house production. And of course, you start getting into the kings of sampling, like anything made by Akai or some of the machine stuff. And of course, the black box is explicitly meant for sampling. In contrast, other people care much more about working directly with synth engines, and that's going to steer towards other devices. The Novation Circuit and the Roland MC101 both have their own synth engines, and while you have a ton of parameters to manipulate directly on the devices, if you want to do sound design 100% from scratch, you will need to do that in a computer. The Korg Electribe requires you to design sounds from scratch as a part of its workflow, which is pretty cool and kind of unique. The Deluge has a lot of sound design from scratch options. Some of Electron's stuff has some really unique sound design, like the Digitone or the Model Cycles. And of course, the Machine Plus friggin' has massive and FM8, which is pretty incredible. Another consideration is number of tracks. And this is actually not as important as you'd think. You can get a lot out of just a few tracks, but it's something worth knowing going in, and worth knowing that different devices count tracks differently. Because the Circuit, it only has 2 synth tracks and 4 drum tracks, but you can have synth tracks pull double duty if they're polyphonic, and you can fit a ton of samples into those 4 sample tracks. The Roland MC101 has even more power with tracks because all the samples can live on one track, freeing up 3 synth tracks. The Electribe has a lot of tracks, provided you don't hit the voice limit, and the Machine Plus has a lot of tracks, provided that you don't hit the CPU limit. The Cycles has 6 tracks, which seems like a lot, until you realize that each track is monophonic, but that doesn't seem so bad once you realize that you can lock different steps to different synth engines or different sounds. Another key feature is the ability to tweak stuff after the fact. And what I mean by this is exporting stuff into a DAW and cleaning it up and processing it further. Stuff like the Circuit just can't, and you have to like solo tracks and record them individually and then line them up manually if you want to do that, which is actually not too bad. I did a whole video on it, but it's something worth knowing going in. Stuff like the Korg Electribe and the Teenage Engineering OP1 just give you wave files, which is pretty cool, but it's not of like a live jam. It's just the tracks as they are. And then the Roland MC101 can actually do USB to a DAW to export multiple tracks as you jam live, which is dope. And as far as I know, Akai stuff and Machine stuff are both great for this hybrid workflow. There's also quantization or no quantization. At this point, being able to play unquantized is a pretty common feature, available across a ton of stuff with 2 notable exceptions. The Electribes and the Pocket Operators, both of those force you to stay on the grid. And earlier I mentioned expandability and the ability to use a device as the brain of a setup. I've seen people like Ricky Tines masterfully use the Circuit as the brain of a setup, and that's a really popular one. I've heard the Electribe is actually fantastic for that, although I've not tested it extensively myself. And I've heard that the MC101 is decent, but maybe a little more finicky. Your mileage may vary. And finally, in features, there's jamming, which I care a lot about. I think the circuit is king for this. The MC101's pretty damn good for this. The Electribe's pretty good for it. I've seen the OPZ used to great effect for this, and I've heard the Deluge is pretty good for this as well. And there are a bunch of other devices, of course. I'm kind of cherry picking stuff that I know more about and that I've personally used, but that's just a quick sampling of stuff that can do live jamming without feeling too like pre-programmed or anything like that. To me, that's important, but it's not necessarily going to be important to everyone else. Different devices will have different aesthetics to the way that they sound, and this might be the deal breaker for some people if they're trying to decide between two devices. Some stuff will be a little more hi-fi or lo-fi, and by lo-fi I don't mean like fewer bits, I mean in terms of the aesthetic. So for instance, if you're comparing the Novation circuit to the Korg Electribe, the Korg Electribe seems somewhat lo-fi and old school in comparison, whereas the circuit is a lot cleaner. But if you're comparing the circuit to the MC101, the MC101 sounds even more polished. But in contrast, the circuit synth engine is capable, I think, of some dirtier, grittier sounds, as is the Electribe, whereas the 101 is a little more clean. And you see how it's this game of whack-a-mole with sounds. Some other examples include pocket operators, which are incredibly dirty and lo-fi, the Machine, which is incredibly clean and high quality, but also has stuff like Massive and FM8 built in, which can get some pretty disgusting sounds. And there's stuff like the Model Cycles, which in my opinion is super clean, but kind of lo-fi, or at least kind of old school. Obviously, this is subjective, and different people are going to have different opinions on how this stuff sounds and on their aesthetics, but it's something that's worth considering. Wrapped up into that is the era of music you're trying to make and the aesthetics of the genres you're trying to make. I tend to live a little bit more in modern electronic dance music, and so I'm looking for stuff that can do some gritty sounds, but very cleanly, if that makes sense. So real quick, let me go genre by genre with some audio examples. Let's start off with hip hop. For clean, modern trap beats, the circuit's pretty solid. The 101, which can also flip samples, has now become my favorite for modern hip hop and trap. And a lot of the higher end groove boxes will handle this style very well. For more kind of lo-fi old school hip hop, I've gotten some decent results out of the circuit, but since it's harder to flip samples in the way that you would expect for this genre, and you can't bring in like real instruments, that's a bit hit or miss. The OP1 is actually a really good candidate for lo-fi hip-hop, and I've used that pretty extensively, although I'm not going to recommend it to everyone because of the price. And the Electribe has a more lo-fi character, but you have to quantize, and so that might be a deal breaker for lo-fi hip-hop. Moving on to EDM, the circuit and the MC101 are both great for modern, polished EDM. Although, do note that I mixed that Roland MC101 track in post. It does not currently have a sidechain option, which is, to use the technical term, heartbreaking. For dirtier, more old school EDM, I think a lot of these devices will serve you very well. The circuit, the Electribe, the 101, and a whole host of others. And for bass music, the circuit synth engine is capable of some disgusting sounds. So if you're creative, you can absolutely use the circuit for bass music. The MC101 is better at switching through a bunch of sounds, but you're gonna have to load in samples that you've made elsewhere or brought in from Splice or somewhere like that in order to make some satisfying dubstep or drum and bass. And let's move on to synthwave. The Electribe is a bit older school, so a lot of old heads will maybe prefer that for something that maybe feels a little more authentic. The circuit is actually fantastic for synthwave, but it's not super analog. And the MC101 is maybe the king for kind of old school style sounds, but maybe a bit too clean for some people. And if we're talking kind of glitchy electronica and IDM, pretty much any of these devices will serve you well depending on the tone that you're going for. Especially because at this point, most of these have incorporated micro steps. And of course, I've only shown samples of the stuff that I've used day in, day out, extensively tested, and know intimately. There are a ton of other Grooveboxes out there, but hopefully this at least gives you a much better idea of what to look for, based on your experience, based on the experience you're looking for, based on the sound you're going for, and based on the price that all of this has to fit into. So, thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to see a video about me chronicling the first part of my search for the best Groovebox, you can click or tap up over here. There will be a part 2 eventually about more expensive ones. And if you'd like to see an entire playlist of Groovebox-based videos from me, you can click or tap up over here. I've linked a bunch of my favorite Grooveboxes in the description. Those are affiliate links, so if you click those, thank you so much. And I'll be back with a new video in a little bit.